So at this point in our examination of members of the animal kingdom, we've seen a couple of these really prominent branch points when you go from this collection of cells that we see in our phylum Porifera to having tissues and developing symmetry and then developing that coelom during gastrulation with this process of basically making that digestive tube that allows your food to move through your body. And we're going to take a look at another member of this group of protostomes out there that, remember, that coelom forms the mouth first before it forms the end of the tube. And when we look at our relatives of the roundworms out there, we are starting to look at phylum Arthropoda. And this group is characterized by their jointed legs. So arthro, think arthritis, your joints, and then poda, think podiatrist, foot. So these guys will have segmented or jointed foots that are out there, and their bodies also are going to have some interesting developments in terms of their segments. Another characteristic of this group is they have that exoskeleton made of chitin, similar to the roundworms that are out there, and that's going to basically prevent physical damage to the internal anatomy. And also, when you look at members of this, the ones that are terrestrial, it's going to help to prevent them from drying out. When you look in the phylum Arthropoda, now we are going to see a very evident change going on when the larvae mature into the adult states. They go through a metamorphosis, and you can think about maggots that you see in your trash or on rotting material out there. Those maggots are going to metamorphosize into the adult form, which is your flies that are out there. And when we look at the phylum Arthropoda, this is a group of animals that are pretty much in any habitat on the planet except for Antarctica, where they're frozen all the time. And they've identified more than 1 million different species. So if you took all the animals that are out there, this phylum Arthropoda is more than 80% of all the described ones. So a lot of variation in this group of animals that are out there. And if we look at some of the characteristics of them, remember what I said, they have some really interesting body segments that are out there. And if you look at this one, what you can see is the first segment of their body is actually the head and the thorax, which makes it known as the cephalothorax. And imagine this would be like you having your head fused to your chest, and in order for you to turn, you would have to actually turn your whole upper body to be able to turn your head there. Notice they do have some antennae for sensory reception, and they do have some mouth parts. So they're starting to develop this head region a little bit more, and that means you're going to also start to develop your ganglia or your brains to interpret all this sensory data that your head is picking up. And remember, if you have this complete digestive system, your food is moving in one end, getting disassembled as it travels through, and then coming out on the other side. The abdominal region in the crustaceans over here is where you're going to see a lot of the reproductive organs and the digestive tract developing there. If you look at your insect group over here, these are a little bit different because notice they have 3 separate segments here. They have the head separated from the thorax, and the head is where you're going to find, again, that ganglia that we look at as the brains of the animal there. You've got your sensory apparatus, you've got your mouth, and then when you move to the secondary segment here, the thorax, now you're going to run into some more of those organs that are out there. But really the whole reason for having that thorax is kind of similar to the thorax that we saw over here, but in this case this is the site of attachment for the legs, but also notice the wings. A lot of people think that the wings are attached to the abdominal region, but if you look closely at an insect, you'll find that they are actually attached really to their chest region, or the equivalent of the chest. All right, if we take a look at some systems inside the arthropods that are out there, if you look at their breathing apparatus or their respiratory systems to allow that exchange of oxygen, because remember, these are aerobic organisms that require oxygen to do aerobic respiration for their energy production, you find a massive variety in terms of their respiratory systems based on their environment. If you're living in the ocean, you can develop gills that are out there, and this is an example in a horseshoe crab where they actually have what are known as book gills that are literally like stacks of structures where you're going to have that exchange of gases in the water that's out there. If you look at your insects that are out there, you do see an interesting little thing. They can use the equivalent of some book lungs that are out there, or if you look at our bee example here, they have these really interesting little holes along the sides of their body here that are known as spiracles, and this is effectively going to allow the gases to move in and out of their bodies. And they do have a trachea, which is the similar thing to your windpipe, but notice multiple openings for breathing and multiple tubes here that allow that oxygen to get into the body of this insect here. And then it's going to diffuse out from those tubes, and it's going to enter the lymph or the fluids inside of that insect there. And you can see if you look at the bottom thing down here with our spider, they do have a very primitive heart, just like what we saw in our insect over here. And that's going to be pumping some of these lymphatic fluids throughout their body to basically bathe their tissue in the oxygen, and also allow them to transport some of their digested food to allow creation of new body parts out there. And here you can see again that little book lung from a side view here, so you can see all the different pages that are in this little lung inside of your spider here. So when we look at these things, we think that they're breathing through their mouth, but no, that's actually just for ingestion of food, that they can actually be breathing through different openings inside of their bodies there. If we look at some of the different groups in this phylum Arthropoda, we can find there are actually 4 groups of what are known as extant subphyla. If you're an extant, that means that you are still alive today and you did not go extinct, like our trilobites that are out there. So we have a lot of information about the trilobites because of fossilized remains that were available for us to get access to their remains and take a look at them. We can see some of the other groups that are out there. There's your hexapods. These are insects that do have 6 legs. And a lot of people assume that all insects are going to possess 6 legs and wings that are out there. It's not necessarily true, but wings are extremely important in terms of diversity because it's allowed a lot of these organisms to move to new locations on land. They don't necessarily have to crawl there, so that could be one reason why there's so much diversity in that animal kingdom with the phylum Arthropoda here. If we look at our second subphylum over here, the Myriapoda, you're looking at these cool little insects that have all of these different body segments, again, duplicating over and over and over right there. And you've got your millipedes and your centipedes that are basically differentiated by looking at the number of pairs of legs on each body segment. Centipedes are also carnivores, where millipedes are herbivores. So centipedes will eat other insects and other animals they can catch, where millipedes are just going to be dining on salad. If you look at your Chelicerata out there, these group of animals are distinguished because their first appendages are actually going to form specialized mouth parts that are typically used for feeding. When you look at spiders, they do modify them to inject venom, but all of these organisms that are out there are going to get grouped together by basically looking at that first fangs that we would see out there. And then this last group, there is your crustaceans. And when we look at our crustaceans, we think of all these different crabs and lobsters and crayfish. These are really the insects of the ocean, and yes, it does indeed include barnacles that are out there. And then one thing that's really surprising to a lot of people is the pill bugs, the roly-polies that are out there, are actually classified with the crustaceans. You can find versions of pill bugs in the ocean out there that get pretty big. Imagine a pill bug that's the size of 2 of your fists put together. But some of those were able to crawl up on land, and these guys do have some of those lungs that will allow them to breathe in the absence of water out there. All right, so let's switch gears a little bit and take a look at, we had our protostomes out there, these true coelomates that were divided into two groups, protostomes and deuterostomes. The protostomes, remember, these guys are going to develop that first opening becomes the mouth, whereas your deuterostome, this one, that part of the tube that forms, is going to form your anus before your mouth. So you can run around telling people that your butt did form before your mouth. And if we look down here, we can see two major groups of organisms come off of our phylogenetic tree. And there's where we have finally reached the part of our phylogenetic tree where we fit in. So this is where we fit in with the chordates over there. And if we look at these organisms that are out there that are related to us, you would never expect to see this, but this is a relic of some ancestral animals that were out there that are different from the other ones because of that formation of the coelom. They're forming one side before the other side, so we can distinguish them. And if we look at our phylum Echinodermata, echino here is basically spiny, and dermata here, think dermis, that's your skin. And so these animals are characterized by having a really spiny skin on the outside. They're pretty much marine animals with about 7,000 species that have been described. And they include things like sea stars, not starfish. That's totally a misnomer. These are sea stars. And then you've got your sea cucumber. You might know University of California, Santa Cruz. They have the banana slug out there. And then you can see your sea urchins, definitely that spiny skin, and then things like sand dollars and also some brittle stars out there, which are basically like a sea star, only a lot skinnier. When you look at them, they do lack body segments. They do show bilateral symmetry, which you look at these things and you say that's not bilateral. As larvae, they are bilateral. And as they become adults, they develop this radial symmetry for a lot of these organisms that are out there, with the exception of your sea cucumber. And if you think about this, it's really an interesting idea, because if you have radial symmetry, that means that you basically don't have a head. You can respond really well in any direction because people can't sneak up behind your back. So when we look at organisms that tend to be on the ground or at the bottom of the ocean here, this idea of radial symmetry as an adult is actually an evolutionary advantage that appears out. So they're going from bilateral back to using that radial symmetry there. When you look at the skeleton around the outside of these guys, it actually is on the inside. It's known as an endoskeleton, and it is a calcium-based one that's going to form from endoderm cells that are out there. And amazingly enough, these guys do actually form a true coelom with a mouth and an anus, and they have a very unique kind of vascular system that has water circulating throughout their bodies and allows gases and nutrients to travel there, but also they use it for movement. And if you've ever had a chance to go and pick up a sea star or a sea urchin out there, if you take them out of the water, they actually cannot move. They need to have water flowing through them, and that puts what's known as hydrostatic pressure on them. And when you look at something like a sea star out there, they move really slow. But if you take a look really closely at this inset picture, you can see that sea star can glob onto a bivalve and then basically just start exerting pressure on it and slowly force that muscular foot that is inside of this thing to relax over time. And then they can basically invert their stomach. So effectively what they do is their stomach leaves their body through an opening, and they will release digestive acids onto that thing and basically slurp it up. So when you look at the digestion of these guys, it's really kind of weird compared to what we're used to thinking about. And what we will look at in our next one is we've gone through all of these different groups of organisms out there, and now we're going to run into another difference that allows us to branch off here and separate from the echinoderms. And this is where we're going to look at the chordates. And so that leads to the question, what the heck evolutionary kind of advantage is it to have chords?